For two students, two things we are going to talk about today, and for some of you, one will go pretty quick, and maybe even the other one too. But here we go. First, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Quadratic equation that does not factor. So I throw the c to the other side. I get rid of the a because it's an equation by dividing by a. I now take half of the coefficient of x, which is b over 2a. Remember that, it's going to come back later. And I square that and get b squared over 4a squared. So I add that to this side. Messing up big time. So I add b squared over 4a squared. So I add that over here, b squared over 4a squared. On the left-hand side, I did that so this would factor 2x plus b over 2a quantity squared. And then getting a common denominator, I get b squared divided by, the common denominator would be 4a squared. What did I multiply this by? 4a over 4a. Writing that in some nice order, I get minus 4ac. Now, back to over here. How do you solve for x? You take the square root of both sides. X plus b over 2a equals plus or minus the square root of this mess. Now, the square root of a fraction is the square root of the numerator divided by the square root of the denominator, which in this case is just 2a. Now I subtract b over 2a, and I get x equals the opposite of b over 2a plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So they had a common denominator, so I'll write it this way. This is known as the quadratic formula, and you may have seen it. But what you need to understand is that it's not magic. It's the mathematical operations of completing the square on this quadratic without numbers. Just putting in letters, not using numbers. And you produce this quadratic formula. So, a couple things that are neat about the quadratic formula. You can jump from a quadratic that doesn't factor to something already solved for x, but you need to be careful. It's always the opposite of the coefficient of b. Notice it's written as ax squared plus bx plus c. So if this is positive here, it's negative here. If this is negative here, it's positive here. Also notice that it's b squared. No matter what this number is, positive or negative, this first number in the square root will always be positive. Doesn't mean what's inside the square root will always be positive. You cannot take the square root of a difference or a sum by individually taking the square roots and then taking the difference of those answers. So order of operations, you have to do b squared minus 4ac before you ever take the square root. And then that whole thing has to be divided by 2a. A lot of people forget the 2. A lot of people forget to divide the whole thing. Memorize quadratic formula if you don't have it memorized, but more importantly, I'd say be able to understand the production of it. Where did it come from? Because it's not that complicated. Couple things come up with the quadratic formula that we need to be careful with. First is this square root of b squared minus 4ac, and I've kind of already messed up on some quizzes by giving you questions where this didn't work out nicely. b squared minus 4ac has a special name. b squared minus 4ac is called the discriminant. It's called the discriminant. I think I forgot an R. This is an R, sorry. Discriminant. It's called the discriminant because it discriminates the kind of answers you get. Remember, to discriminate really just means to set apart, to make different. And when you talk about the quadratic formula, if I write it in here, negative b plus or minus the square root of that mess all over 2a, it's this part that's going to cause some problems. Because if you get a number that's positive, well, then you add a square root and you subtract a square root. And you end up getting two answers whenever this is some positive number. You get two solutions. If it equals 0, well, then you get negative b plus or minus 0 all over 2a. That's actually just one solution to the quadratic. It's a solution that happens twice. And then lastly, if it's less than 0, you get something called no real solution. And some of you have seen this happen and have been confused because you ended up getting a negative number here. So the next thing we're going to talk about this week is what happens when you take the square root of a negative number. What do we get? I don't know. Well, I do know because I'm a math teacher, and some of you may know too, right? Let's have some nice surprised eyes there, like, oh my gosh, this guy is shocked, right? Square root of a negative number. I'll tell you, it's built on this principle that we studied at the beginning of the year, that the square root of a times b is the square root of a times the square root of b. So the square root of a negative number will always be the square root of -1 times the square root of that number. So we can always separate the negative out. And when we do, we call that I. I for imaginary. And we will talk about imaginary solutions a little bit later and imaginary numbers. But right now, what I want you to know, what you have to have for tomorrow is, what is the quadratic formula? The quadratic formula says if ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, then x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, that whole mess divided by 2a. Mathematically, using the quadratic formula is no different than completing the square. So there's two ways to solve a quadratic. The two ways are to factor, which is always easiest and a good skill to always look for. And then second, it's to complete the square. If we complete the square on the general quadratic, we get the quadratic formula. The other thing I want you to know for tomorrow is that b squared minus 4ac is called the discriminant, and it has special, it tells you things about quadratics if it's greater than 0, equal to 0, or less than 0. And the things it tells you is that you either get two solutions to the quadratic, one solution, or two imaginary or no real solution. Real meaning real numbers. Good. That's the brief summary of what you need for Monday. Review solving quadratics by factoring and by completing the square. But Monday, it's all quadratic formula. All right. Peace.